Guy that's ahead of his time. He's very, very well read. He understands what's taking place out there today. He understands about the so-called political correctness, what we've been talking about, and about the Gestapo in America. And what he's going to be telling you tonight is where we're heading. In fact, on the radio program tonight, Larry Nichols and I are going to do a little parody about things like what was done. You remember War of the Worlds a few years ago with Orson Welles? We're going to do something similar to that, but about what's going to happen if that legislation passes a year from now. And so you might want to tune into the radio program. But you're going to get an education here tonight. And this is something, too, is that we really need to do in the Tea Party. We really need to awaken the Tea Party movement to what has taken place, too, on a national basis. We can't worry just about what's local, because we're not going to have any local Tea Party if things progress the way they are. So, saying that, Scott is a pastor, he's a lawyer, he's an internationally known speaker, and you know he's a good guy because he's got himself in trouble with Obama, with the LGBT, #1 man on their hit list nationwide, and he's even at odds with our good old Southern poverty law firm. So, everybody, Scott,
thank you, Jesus.
Thank you, Pastor. God bless you guys. Thanks for coming out tonight. And I'm Dr. Scott Lively. I'm very pleased to be able to be here with you tonight. My wife and I are on a speaking tour, summer speaking tour across the northern states. We usually go in the winter and do the southern states, but this time we're doing across the north. And we're on our way back to Massachusetts, and where we have a home where my wife and I run an inner-city mission in Springfield, Massachusetts. We also have a residence in Riverside, California, a little casita, it's called, a little house, about 400 square feet on the back part of my son's property in Riverside, where we, well actually it's grandparent quarters, because my first grandchild, Camille, was born there about 1.5 years ago, and there's nothing like, anybody grandparents here? Nothing like grandkids, right? It's the best. It's the best. So we are going to be spending our winters in Riverside, our summers in Springfield, and traveling back and forth in the spring and fall. And so we have to be here tonight. I have been really privileged to be a friend of your pastor, and on his show quite a number of times. He helped to open my eyes in the early days of meeting him to the significance of the communist aspects of what we're facing, which really, he has a lot of background information that is not part of the mainstream, and you don't find that in very many places. I'm really pleased with it. Well, the most important thing to know about me is that I'm a sinner saved by grace, an alcoholic and a drug addict for 16 years, healed and delivered in 1986 when I got down on my knees and I surrendered my life to Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Amen. And just in 1 second, I was healed and delivered, never had another desire to take drugs or drink ever again.
Thank you, Jesus.
And my life has been completely transformed. I used to be the kind of guy you'd see stumbling out from behind an old abandoned building with long greasy hair, leaves hanging in it. And today, I'm a licensed attorney in California. I've got 2 advanced degrees, including a THD. I've got credentials in international human rights from Strasbourg. I've been to 40 countries. I've ministered in 30 of them. I've written 5 books, been on more than 800 radio and television shows all over the world. And as the pastor said, I'm currently the global enemy #1 of the LGBT movement, according to the Human Rights Campaign. They put out a report last fall of the 10 top adversaries, and I was in the #1 slot. I am being sued in federal court in Springfield for crimes against humanity, for preaching against homosexuality in Uganda. Now, crimes against humanity was a category of crimes created to prosecute the Nazis after Nuremberg. See, this is something that everybody should be aware of, that at that time the world was shifting very rapidly away from a natural law perspective. And there was something called legal positivism that was embraced by all the countries of the Western world. And really, it's where the idea of national sovereignty crossed the line into a sort of idolatry, where the idea of national sovereignty became more important than God himself. And the Nazis, when they were finally defeated and they were being hauled up on charges, their defense was, you have no jurisdiction over us. You embrace legal positivism the same that we do, that says there's no higher legal authority than the nation, than the laws of the nation. And the Allies had to think fast, and so they revived natural law for that time period in order to prosecute the Nazis. They said there are some things that violate the law above the law, what they call the conscience of the nations. So they introduced 3 categories of crimes at that point that are the foundation for the International Criminal Court. And it's expanded somewhat since then, but those were genocide, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And there was one nation would aggress against another nation in a warlike fashion. And so here I am, and I know this because I've studied international human rights. I know the history of human rights all the way back, 4,000 years. In fact, I'm the author of the Riga Declaration on, what was it called? Religious Freedom, Family Values, and Human Rights, which was published in Riga, Latvia in 2006 or 2007. It's published on my website, defendthefamily.com. And it is a summary of the history of human rights and where it comes from. Now, in the modern world, the leftists have created a new category of human rights, of civil rights, that has never existed, has never been recognized, never been protected in the history of the world. And that is what's called sexual orientation regulations. And that's what we're fighting against now. That's what the whole battle, the whole culture war regarding homosexuality goes to that fundamental issue. And so I want to give a little background on how we got to where we are right now, and then touch on things that are happening right now, the implications for them, and then talk about solutions, because we don't want to just talk about the horror stories and have no way to be able to respond to it. There are ways to respond, although honestly we have been outmaneuvered considerably by the cultural Marxists. Well, the history of the homosexual movement is very dark and dirty, as you can imagine, and I have chronicled it. Some of it I've chronicled in my book, The Pink Swastika. But even before the Pink Swastika, and I didn't even know this until I went to the National Archives and dug out all the copies, the early copies of the Journal of Homosexuality. This is like the preeminent journal of the homosexual movement, written by their scholars about themselves. And Gert Hakema of the University of Amsterdam wrote an article about the early roots of the homosexual movement, and in his analysis, the pioneer of so-called gay rights was the Marquis de Sade, all the way back in the late 1700s. Marquis de Sade, whose name is known for sadism, was an extremely wicked man. He was sentenced to death for sodomizing and murdering his butler, and he was the one who began the process of arguing for the decriminalization of homosexuality in the world. He didn't get very far. In his time, nobody was going for that. And it really wasn't until almost a century later, not quite a century, in Germany, that the movement really took off. That's where the pink swastika, that's what this history is about. The pink swastika is the subtitle, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party, but the story really is the German gay subculture out of which the Nazi Party came. And in order to really understand this history, you really have to have an understanding of Marxism. And when we're talking about Marxism, Marxism is not just communism. And what most people really don't know, a lot of even mainstream modern historians don't really know, don't pay attention to, is that Germany at the time of World War I, right in that time frame, which is where so much of this stuff emerged, was dominated by Marxism in three different forms. There was communism, which had a victory in taking Russia. And so there's Soviet-style communists. Then there was the socialists, which is the least hostile, least damaging of the three forms. The socialists were in control of the German government, the Weimar government. They were socialists. And then there were the fascists. And the fascists eventually were known as National Socialists, is another branch of Marxism. And those three factions were in opposition with each other in that time frame. As a matter of fact, the threat to the socialist government was not coming from the nationalists at that point as much as it was coming from the Soviet-style communists. And they had almost taken Bavaria. And what the socialists did is they bolstered and strengthened the fascists to be a counter force on the streets against the Soviets, because the Soviets-style communists had that same street brawling practice and mentality that became later recognized as what the brown shirts did. When you talk about brown shirts, that's what the Soviets, communists, were doing before the brown shirts were doing.
Yeah,
They
the
just
red
copied
shirts.
them. Yeah, the red shirts. Matter of fact, what the brown shirts were in those days, they were called beefsteaks, brown on the outside and red on the inside, right? Because there was so much of an overlap between those two. However, there was a big split between them, and that was in the two different factions of the homosexual movement that they belonged to. The masculine-oriented male homosexuals were the ones aligned with and who started the Nazi Party, and the effeminate male homosexuals were the ones aligned with the communists, and they really had much more of the power. Their group started. Karl Heinrich Ulrichs was the man who was called the grandfather of the gay movement. He was from the 1860s, and he's the one who invented the third sex theory, the born that way argument. He called this third sex theory. Said that male homosexuals are really female souls trapped inside men's bodies. Lesbians is just the reverse, and since this was something outside of their control, then we should really treat it as a medical condition, not a moral weakness. One of his friends, in furtherance of that idea and objective, invented the term homosexuals. It didn't exist until 1869, and it was invented to sanitize homosexuality, to sanitize sodomy, which up until that time was, they were called sodomites. For briefly in Germany, they were also called inverts, but that really didn't take hold, and homosexual became the term of choice. Ulrich started the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. That was the name of his organization, and he was later succeeded by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was the head of that organization and who started the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, which was like the Kinsey Institute of Germany. And it became the center for sexual research in the nation. And that's where anybody who was convicted of sex crimes in Germany was sent to that institute for treatment, right? They're being treated by homosexuals themselves who are running this thing. Hirschfeld was the man who invented the term hermaphrodite. which is a person who is born with both set of genitalia, it's a birth defect. Well, the masculine homosexuals in Germany were very offended by Ulrich's theory that homosexual men were really female souls trapped inside men's bodies. They said, we have nothing to do with femininity. In fact, and they didn't. They were very butch, very mad. They rejected masculinity. They called the effeminate homosexuals Kummerlings, puny beings, and they hated them. And that's who, when the Nazis came to power, that's who they persecuted. There were some homosexuals that were put in work camps, not the death camps, unless they happened to be Jewish or one of a select group that they were trying to exterminate. But they put them in work camps, and in modern times the homosexuals have tried to use those facts and create a false gay holocaust to try to gain sympathy for themselves. And frankly, that's one of the reasons that we wrote the book, to counter that, because this really is the evidence that counters and contradicts their attempt to create a gay holocaust. And that was a big deal, because that was remember, that was the symbol of their movement. If you've been paying attention to this culture war battle for long enough, you know that they weren't using the rainbow until after we stopped them from using the pink triangle. There was the inverted pink triangle was the symbol of the movement, and they were using that specifically on purpose, deliberately, to invoke the Nazi relationship so they could use the public sympathy, like the Jews have public sympathy because of the Holocaust. They wanted that kind of public sympathy as a basis for being able to change our society through social engineering. Well, we stopped that. In fact, there was a Jewish doctor from New Jersey that read the pink swastika and was blown away and offered to help any way that he could. And we asked him to write a cover letter to the rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis. And then we had another friend who gave us the mailing list of all the Orthodox rabbis in the United States. And we sent a copy of this book to at least half the list with the cover letter from the doctor. And that was really the turning point. That's why they had to stop using the pink triangle at that point, because we had exposed them. Then they adopted the rainbow as their symbol, and that's why this book is Redeeming the Rainbow. Once again, it's trying to take the symbol back away from them that they should not hold. The rainbow is the symbol of the authority and presence of God.
Amen.
It's 3 primary places in the scripture where you find it. It's in Genesis 9, I forget the exact address, but related to the flood. God said, "This is my covenant with you." And then in Ezekiel 1:28, again, God is associating the rainbow with the presence and authority of God.
Amen.
And the last location is Revelation 4:3. And at the throne of God, a rainbow emanates from the throne of God, indicating His presence. So it's not an accident that the homosexuals have stolen the rainbow as their symbol. They are attempting to sanitize sodomy. They're attempting to sanitize what God has called depraved and an abomination by wrapping themselves in His cloak. And there's nothing more offensive to God than that kind of rebellion and arrogance and belligerence, right? And that's they're going to face a very severe penalty for that. Those who do not repent of it. Well, that movement that had started in Germany grew to full power, and it was a significant reason for the collapse of Germany into anarchy and war, moral anarchy. People don't know, but the Weimar government after World War I was as wicked as San Francisco has ever been. They had every kind of sexual perversion was rampant in the big cities.
Wow.
In fact, they would have transvestite balls. We haven't even seen that in this country yet. They would have transvestite balls with hundreds of men dressed like women and hundreds of women dressed like men who would come together in public spectacles. They had prostitution of every form on the streets, including teens, mother and daughter teens, and father and son teams of prostitutes. And this was how wicked it was. And so it wasn't it was understandable that the German people, the average person, was completely repulsed by this. And so when Hitler came along pretending to be a moralist, someone who was going to clean this up, they jumped on it, not knowing, well, a lot of people knew that he was wrapped up in this himself, but he killed most of the people who had any actual knowledge of it. And like we were talking, Pastor Ernie and I were talking about before, you know, that there's been evidence about the baby parts harvesting and market that's been out there for a very long time. But if there's no real evidence of it, then it's just, you know, he said, she said, and the people who are in power find it easy to cover up. The same thing about Hitler, as all kinds of people knew that Hitler had been a male prostitute in Munich and Vienna, and they knew that the brown shirts were homosexuals, but there was no real proof of it, and so all it was just rumor mongering. And then what's called the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, that Hitler killed Ernst Röhm, and really that whole story is there's a lot of details in there I'm not going to get into, but it was not what it appeared to be, and the people who carried out that what was called the Rome Purge were homosexuals as well, even though a number of the people that were killed were homosexual. But Hitler actually used that opportunity to kill all of his enemies and anybody who knew anything about his past. And so when Hitler came along and argued that he was going to stand up against this perversion, the people believed him and they supported the Nazi Party. And really, there were really no choices in Germany. I mean, you could either go with the communists or you could go with the fascists. Really, that was it. And that was really the choice across the world, too. The Soviet communism was really growing. And here in the United States, that was the choice that seemed to be, you know, this was the future. You know, they talk about being on the right side of history, right? There's two options for history at this point. They're both Marxist. One of them is called communism, one of them is called fascism, and the Americans went with fascism too. In the pre-war years, there was huge support for Hitler in the United States. Huge. They had giant parades. They had meetings all over the United States, and in England as well. There were just pictures that came out a few weeks ago of Queen Elizabeth and her siblings doing the Sieg Heil salute in the garden of Buckingham Palace, right? Because it was all the rage, and it wasn't until what they were really all about was exposed that everybody turned against the fascists. But they looked like they were the answer to the communists at the time. So it's like, what do you want? Would you rather be shot or stabbed?
Yeah, really.
Right? That's the choices. Well, the American homosexual movement was a spin-off of the German. And there was a German-American soldier named Henry Gerber who was part of the occupation force after World War I. And he was a member of the Society for Human Rights. Right? Once again, there's nothing new under the sun. None of this is new. The Born That Way argument isn't new, and the use of civil rights or human rights as a central theme of promoting homosexuality isn't new either. As a matter of fact, the very people who created the Nazi Party also created the Society for Human Rights. And the most prominent member was Ernst Röhm, who was the power of the Nazi Party at the beginning. He was more powerful than Hitler was. And it was only after time that Hitler rose to greater power. See, Röhm had been a captain in the military before, and the Nationals were all organized around the military structure. The Treaty of Versailles had prevented Germany from having any more than 100,000 men in arms. And so the nationalist forces were primarily out-of-work soldiers who wanted to overthrow the socialist government and replace it with a fascist one. And Ernst Röhm was huge in this. He was not just hadn't just been a captain. Hitler was just a corporal, but he had also had very, very high-level, high-powered friends, wealthy friends, throughout the military-industrial complex. He was the man, and Hitler just rose because of his political astuteness and, I think, demonic possession. Right?
Yeah, no doubt.
And so Ernst Röhm was the most powerful and prominent member of the German Society for Human Rights. at the time when Henry Gerber came back from Germany and started the first American chapter of the Society for Human Rights here in Chicago, Illinois, December 10th, 1924. Well, it didn't last very long because Gerber and the two other men that had done it were arrested for molesting teenage boys, which is very, very common. It's called pederasty. In fact, the whole Catholic Church scandal, it's not pedophilia, it's pederasty. It's adult homosexual men and teenage boys, young teenage boys. And it's the core of male homosexual culture going all the way back to the Greeks and even before. Well, Henry Gerber managed to escape prosecution by bribing the judge. The other two men went to jail. He went underground. He molested a teenage boy who grew up, and when he grew up, he molested a teenage boy named Harry Hay. And Harry Hay became the leader of the first homosexual organization that lasted, called the Mattachine Society. And he was a teacher of Marxist theory for 18 years. And so he knew how to organize. He knew, and let's just stop for a second. You probably know this because you've heard pastors speak so many times, but Marxism was Karl Marx's interpretation and application of Darwinian evolution to human society. And it was the idea that he had the idea, in fact, he had been a Christian, and I think he even knew, having read the Bible, he knew about the millennial kingdom, you know, and I think he had a lot of confusion in his mind. But he said, you know, sometime very, very far in the future, human society is going to evolve into a perfect socialist utopia. And he said, but since we know what it's going to look like, then why don't we just destroy what we have right now and build on the ashes, right? Why don't we get rid of this mess, this capitalistic mess, and we'll build that. That's what Marxism has always been about. It's always been about destroying Judeo-Christian civilization and building a socialist utopia on the ashes. And so that's what was going on with all these various forms of Marxists. Well, Harry Hay had learned all these tactics about how to take down a society through subversion, and he organized gay activists together in secret subgroups for that purpose, except instead of his focus was much more on his own agenda, which was a sexual agenda, not a political one, and he wanted homosexuality to be normalized in society. Well, this is the late 1940s and early 50s, and if Harry Hay and his friends had come out and said, we're going to go down to the elementary school, and we're going to take this book, Heather Has Two Mommies, and we're going to get the kids together, we're going to read it to them, and we're going to tell them that homosexuality is good and normal, they would have been thrown in jail that day, because homosexuality was illegal in the United States. All over the world it was illegal, except for Sweden, which had decriminalized sodomy in 1948. And, but they were determined they were going to change society, so what did they have to do? They couldn't come out and start promoting homosexuality. What they did was they started promoting heterosexual promiscuity. They wanted to get all you dirty in the deal, so that when it came time to start promoting homosexuality, you weren't going to resist it anymore, because you were all mixed up with pornography and abortion and cheating outside your marriage and all those things. And that's exactly what they set out to do. What's his name? Alfred Kinsey was the first major agent of that agenda. And in fact, he did almost the whole job himself. His Sexual Behavior of the Human Male that came out in 1948. That's the source of the Born That Way. Well, he popularized it in America. The 10% myth. The idea that the majority of people were engaged in various forms of adultery or whatever. It was all lies. He just skewed the statistics to promote his own agenda. Nobody knew he was an in-the-closet homosexual. Nobody knew that until Judith Reisman exposed him, you know, at least 20 years later. And then he went all over the United States, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, to teach this to college-age young men in the elite universities, right? And of course, this is like giving candy to kindergartners, right? They just eat it up. You know, who better to try to sell the idea of unlimited sexual freedom to than 18 to 20-year-old men, right? That was and that's exactly what happened. And then the next major player to follow was Hugh Hefner, who took Kinsey. He called himself Kinsey's pamphleteer. That was he admitted that. And all he did was take Kinsey's ideas about so-called sexual freedom, which is really sexual anarchy, and put pictures to it. And then he popularized it among the blue collar, and then that was the beginning of the modern porn industry, and things started to fall. Well, if you're going to have a society that embraces sexual freedom over family, there's a few things that have to be in place. So, and the globalists have always been on this. They've always known that the way to take down the society, ever since Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, they've known that the better way is not the economic issues, it's not the fiscal issues, it's the social issues. That's how you take down the society. It's the old strategy of Balaam. You know, Balaam, who refused to curse God's people for King Balak, instead told Balak, just get them involved with the foreign women, get them involved in sexual perversion, and they'll take themselves down. Right? That's the strategy. And that's exactly Balak got the Hebrews involved with the Moabite women who were involved in all of the perverse Canaanite rituals, and they fell. Same thing with America. So that's what's been going on here. There's been the promotion of sexual perversion as a way to take America down, soften us up, so we can be conquered essentially and folded in to a one-world government. And this sexual revolution has been that tool all over the world. In fact, that was what was going on in Uganda. That's how I ended up there in the first place. And I'm being sued for crimes against humanity for preaching against homosexuality there. But the only reason that I was there in the first place is that the Ugandans had had tremendous success stopping, or at least overturning, the AIDS epidemic. They went from having the highest to the lowest level of AIDS in Africa by promoting abstinence and fidelity in marriage. They were following a biblical model. They had a gigantic success. And everybody around the world was looking, look what Uganda just did. When the globalists were using condom education and the sexual revolution everywhere else, saying that they wanted to stop AIDS, but really just using that as a pretext to push sexual perversion in all these societies. And Uganda was a huge threat to them. So they went in and started to try to kickstart the sexual revolution in that very morally conservative country that had been in Christian revival for quite a number of years. And they reacted and said, what's going on here? And so they held their first national conference on pornography and obscenity in 2002. And just by divine providence, their speaker that they had fell through, and they didn't have anybody. And a man that was working on trying to set that up, an American, his father was a guy named Warren Willis, a missionary to Mongolia that was back in the United States. He had just come and heard me preach and teach at a big Hispanic rally in Southern California. And he said, Lively could do this, right? So he calls me and said, would you be willing to go to Uganda? I said, yes. And so I flew there, 2 days in the air there, 2 days in the air back for 3 days on the ground. So 4 days in the air for 3 days on the ground to go and do this. And I became really the advisor to the Ugandan pro-family movement right out of the gate. And had this tremendous honor of speaking to the leaders of Ugandan society in their national parliament hall. You know, the ministers of government, the Supreme Court justices, the heads of all the religions of the country, including the Muslims, were all there. And I'm looking around, and they were coming and telling me the things that were going on, and I just kind of looked around and I said, well, I know exactly what's going on here, because this is what they did in my country too, and this is what they're doing in other places. So I laid it all out for them. And I said, this is what's going to happen next. And sure enough, that's what happened. I went back a few months later, I did the media, I spread the word, and then in 2009, they hadn't been able to stop it. You know, Soros and well, his crowd had been involved. What Soros does in order to take down countries is he goes in and he buys media and he sets up grassroots Marxist street organizations. And then they cooperate together, the media and these street activists, in order to overthrow the society. And he's very, very good at this. He's perfected the system. He also messes with their currency at the same time to take them down faster. He creates crises with his billions of dollars of assets and his knowledge of the currency markets. That's how he made all of his money. And so anyway, that's what's going on in Uganda too. And this is where we are now, is in the world, is we have this gigantic Balaam strategy that is being used all over. And here in this country, it took longer for them to do it the first few times. But after they perfected it, it just went faster and faster and faster. It took them 40 years to take down the U.S., but it only took them 10 years to take down Brazil, and it only has taken them a couple years to take down some of the Eastern European countries, right? Because they got the system down, and the more they do it, the stronger they are, because every organization that they take over is added to their resources, right? And this is shown in the way, who would have thought that the biggest surprise enemy that we would have in 2015 would be the Chamber of Commerce, right? That's who took down, that's who forced Governor Pence to put in those amendments to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that made it worse than if they'd done nothing, right? Wow. It's the Chamber of Commerce that did that. How did that happen? Well, you have to look and see, once again, the history of the homosexual movement, how this works. Up until 1969, their goal was the right to be left alone. But then, in 69, June 28, 1969, which is the anniversary of the Stonewall Riot, Stonewall Bar, mafia-owned bar on Christopher Street in New York City, the police went to arrest a 14-year-old drag queen prostitute who used to service the men in that bar. And this was at the height of 60s radicalism. Herbert Marcuse's strategies had come to fruition. He's the one who really taught the Frankfurt School ideas of cultural Marxism, with the focus on social issues and not fiscal issues. Well, the homosexuals rioted against the police, and that's celebrated today annually as Gay Pride Day. A lot of people don't know that, but that's what Gay Pride Day is. Well, that was also the day that they abandoned the right to be left alone as their goal, and they adopted the goal of supremacy. Total control of all the cultural, political, and social institutions in their own hands, or the hands of people that are their total allies. And they began in 1973. Actually, in 72, they met in Chicago. 200 homosexual organizations met in Chicago. They came up with the first gay rights platform. That's in this book right here. I've got a copy of the 72 platform in here and the 1993 updated platform. You know, people say, well, what gay agenda? What gay agenda? Well, of course, they've got an agenda. Any movement has an agenda. It's just a list of things to accomplish. And they had several of them that are published. Well, once they got organized all together on that theme, then they began what was called the Long March Through the Institutions. Anybody heard that phrase before? The Long March Through the Institutions, that was, once again, that was a Marcusean strategy, because he taught that you work inside the system, not outside the system. You just simply take it over. And that's what they began doing. 1973, they took down the American Psychiatric Association, simply by harassment and intimidation, brown shirt tactics. They would go into the conferences where the doctors were, and they would kick over tables, they would shout them down, they called them war criminals, and after a while they couldn't take it anymore. They capitulated, they let the gays into the power structure, and then once they were in there, they forced a vote. This wasn't science, this was a political vote, and they controlled the mailing list. It was a vote by mail. They controlled the mailing list, and of course they won, and then they have never given up. They've always had control of the APA ever since. And that's been the same with every single other entity that they've taken down over the years. Once they got control of it, they never gave it back up again. I don't know of a single entity, I don't know if you do, Pastor, I don't know of a single entity that they have conquered over the past 40 years that we have ever taken back from them. And it only took them 40 years to defeat every single secular opponent that they had, the last one being the Boy Scouts of America in 2013. So 73 to 2013, that's just 40 years. 40, you know, the biblical number of testing. And so we are in a, so after that, once the Boy Scouts went down, the one before the Boy Scouts, that was the U.S. military. The U.S. military was taken down the year before, and when they repealed, don't ask, don't tell was a compromise that we didn't have to make. In fact, my friend Ron Ray, Colonel Ron Ray, was the attorney who actually was the attorney who was fighting don't ask, don't tell. When back at the beginning, there was no don't ask, don't tell. It was just, no, you're not going to do it. And we actually won that case, and then the military hierarchy went ahead because of political pressure, and they accepted, they put the compromise in anyway. Don't ask, don't tell was the compromise. Then, once enough time had passed, and these guys have been working a long, long-term strategy, they got a long horizon, then they just went for the repeal once they knew the time was right, and they did it. And now our military is gutted, and Obama has eliminated 200 of the top conservative military leaders out of the military, I believe, because he was tracking to see which ones were going to be the most trouble, because he was monitoring all of their communications, because he has the NSA and all the spying that was going on.
Yep.
And you know, that spying, I believe, is directly associated with homosexuality also. People don't realize this, but the homosexuals were not allowed to be involved in the intelligence agencies. They could not get top secret security clearance until 1992, when Bill Clinton gave it to them by executive order as a consolation prize, because he was not able to get gays in the military through, right? That was, remember, and just look, this goes all the way back to Clinton, right? That 1992, this guy gets elected, and the homosexual had so much power that that was his first agenda item once he got elected, right? That shows you who was really pulling the strings at that time. The country just wasn't going to go for it at that time, and so he wasn't able to make it happen. So he gave them top secret security clearance, and if you know anything about this movement and these people, they love this stuff, right? They live for political intrigue and conspiracies and manipulation. Their whole lives have been lived in the shadow, in the secret, because they can't be, they can't identify themselves as who they really are, or there would be opposition. Even today, the thing that defines the LGBT agenda more than anything else is deceit. Everything is a lie. Right? Well, there's some truth mixed in, enough to be able to sucker you in, but it's all a lie. Misrepresentations and outright falsehoods, etc. Well, how do we get, where are we right now? Well, jumping ahead, after they had defeated the last secular opponent, all the guns, all the trained, cultured warriors had no other opponents except the church. And they have been focused on the church since 2013, which is the same time frame that the gay marriage battle has mostly been fought. And that passage of the Obergefell case was a direct assault on Christianity. That's what it was about. Homosexuals don't care about marriage. There's nothing. Many of them have even admitted it's just a tactic to be able to take down Judeo-Christian civilization, because marriage is so central to what it means to follow God.
Amen.
But it was an attack on the church, and it was the first step. And they always follow through behind these cases with a gigantic political move. Remember the Lawrence versus Texas case? That was 2003. That was the repeal of the sodomy laws, in which Justice Kennedy struck down Bowers versus Hardwick, which is the case that had recognized the right of states to criminalize or even to regulate sexual behavior in the public interest. So in Lawrence versus Texas, they wiped out the ability of states to regulate sex, really introducing sexual anarchy in a legal context for the first time. And then immediately, just after that, that was the first so-called gay marriage ruling in my home state of Massachusetts. I wasn't there at the time, but and it was a 1-2 punch. They never would have put that through if they hadn't first done the repeal of the sodomy laws. And the same thing, they couldn't repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell until they repealed the sodomy law in the military. You know, sodomy in the common law is not oral or anal sex. It's Leviticus 18, 22, and 23. It's homosexuality and bestiality. That's what sodomy is. And in the common law, you look at Blackstone's commentary, you look at the law at the time of the founding of the country, and you look at the law in the U.S. military right up until 2011 or whatever it was, 2012, when they finally repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They had to legalize sex with animals. in order to be able to put gays in the in order to put the repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
God
And
forbid.
that's just a simple fact. And so here we are right now. They are attacking from the outside as aggressively as they can, and we're about to get hit with something 10 times worse than the gay marriage ruling, and most Christians don't even know that it's there. It's called the Federal Equality Act. The Federal Equality Act is to put an anti-discrimination policy at the federal level. Now let me tell you folks, and this is that after 25 years of fighting this, I can tell you, the anti-discrimination policy based on sexual orientation is the seed that contains the entire tree of the homosexual agenda with all of its poisonous fruit. If you let that seed go in, the entire agenda follows like clockwork. And that's the way it's worked all over the United States. It's these, I'll call them sexual orientation regulations. That's what they call them in England. When they put them in England, right? You know, ever heard of the Magna Carta? The Magna Carta, the most ancient and venerable secular human rights document that exists, going back to 1215. The Magna Carta's first principle is the English church must be free, right? Meaning that the church would not be regulated by the government, right? And that the values of the church would be sacrosanct. Well, that stood for 800 years, almost 800 years, until the sexual orientation regulations were enacted by the British government, and then the Magna Carta protection of the church fell, and the church came under the direct assault of the homosexuals, and the church began being subject to these regulations. And anyone following, any Christians in England, you know, they had to shut down adoption agencies, bed and breakfasts. People were prosecuted under the sexual orientation regulations, and the same ones that we have here. It's all the same thing. The Aaron and Melissa Klein from Sweet Cakes by Melissa in Oregon,
Right.
Baronel Stutzman, I pronounced the name wrong probably, all the rest of them, how are they able to be prosecuted? Why are they being punished and persecuted? Anti-discrimination policies based on sexual orientation regulations. That's what they're going to put through in the federal government, right? There's 165 co-sponsors in the House, and a similar proportion in the Senate. I don't know if we can stop this, but if there's any possibility, we need to do that. You need to call your congressman and senator, tell them, please do not, you must not pass the Federal Equality Act. I don't even know what the number of it is, but they'll know what you're talking about. Look it up before you do this. Get online, do some research, and then follow up on it. We got to kill it. We got to kill this, because if that goes through, that's the end of the First Amendment. Right now, after Obergefell, the last bastion we have, the last barrier we have to their power is the right to speak out. Even religious freedom isn't safe, right? Really, so the part of the First Amendment that is still strong enough to defeat them is really only the freedom of speech. But once this goes through at the federal level, then they will chomp down, stomp down on freedom of speech. And this is lawless Obama. This is the man who doesn't care even what the limits of the law are already. He's now going to have a law. And this is what happens with these anti-discrimination policies. They always sell them on the idea that it's going to protect homosexuals from discrimination in housing and employment. That's how they're sold. And most people go along with that. I mean, I don't want homosexuals to be discriminated in housing and employment. They should not be able to work in a factory just because they're homosexual. And so long as it's not a bed and breakfast or something like that, you know, they shouldn't necessarily, I mean, well, I do believe in laws about morality, but just in terms of having an apartment someplace, right? But are there any cases of discrimination against homosexuals in mainstream society? No, there hasn't been for 20 years. People aren't discriminating on that basis anymore. If anything, they go on the exact opposite. They discriminate against Christians.
Right.
And so there's no reason even to put that forward. But what the real purpose of this is, once the policy is enacted as law, it's enforced as a blanket prohibition on all disapproval of homosexuality. It's completely forgotten that it was put in only to protect against housing and employment discrimination, and it's treated as if it's a blanket prohibition on all disapproval of the gay agenda. That's how they took down the Boy Scouts after all those years. You know, the Boy Scouts of America had a Supreme Court ruling, Dale versus Boy Scouts of America, that gave them the right, it recognized their right to discriminate against homosexuals in the ranks and in the leadership. There's nothing stronger than that. They couldn't be taken down legally. But did the homosexuals stop going after them? No. They never stopped. They just increased their harassment. They went after every relationship that the boys had with every town, every county, every facility where the Boy Scouts would use a marina or a campground, and harassed. But even that, the Boy Scouts still stood up against that. But the last straw, the thing that took them down finally, see, they had started to cave, and they allowed 2 homosexual business leaders onto their board, right? Thinking that's going to placate them. Folks, you cannot placate these people. They're implacable, right? They're implacable. You want to see the spirit of the homosexual movement? Look at Genesis 19. It's when they came, all the men from every corner of the city, young and old, came to rape the 2 angels in the form of men who were at Lot's house. And they would not be deterred even after being struck blind. That's the spirit. You cannot reason them. It's like the Terminator. You can't reason with them. You cannot compromise with them. They will take every bit of compromise you give them, and they will keep pushing forward because they are after total dominance and supremacy over the entire world. But they're working out here in the United States faster than any place else. And that's what we're up against. So this anti-discrimination policy mess, these sexual orientation regulations, are really the killer. And that's how they took down the Boy Scouts, because once what they did is they went after the corporate donors, and all these corporations had adopted anti-discrimination policies, sexual orientation regulations, and they went to these companies and said, your donations to the Boy Scouts of America is a violation of your own internal anti-discrimination policies. And the big corporations said, well, hey, you know, you're right. And once they did that, see, it was the Chamber of Commerce in the end that took down the Boy Scouts. And the elites had gone along with the elites are up to their eyeballs. And Robert Gates, who had been a Bush appointee, Department of Defense, he was the one who implemented homosexuality after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He then left that post and he went to the Boy Scouts. He's now the president of the Boy Scouts. He's doing the same thing there, and then implementing homosexuality in the Boy Scouts. So that's how the corporations have gotten so messed up. The homosexuals would, and I was writing about this back in the 1990s, right? The long march through the institutions, they take over like a virus. They'll take over an entity. It's not like a virus, really. It's like the invasion of the body snatchers. And they would get one of their people in a hiring position in a company, which they can do because they're the perfect secret agents for their own agenda, because nobody knows they're homosexual unless they tell